Greetings, mythology students. This is the second video of the week on the ideas of Claude Lévi-Strauss, a French anthropologist, 1908 to 2009. So someone fairly recently departed who had a great influence on our era, particularly in anthropological studies, the study of human culture. And I'll quickly talk about some of his ideas. We're not going to get too heavily into this because it's a very detailed and sophisticated, nuanced system that he devised, and we just don't have time to really explore in full. The chapter that you read is accompanied in the book with another chapter which explains how his ideas can be attached to the Gilgamesh myth that we read the first week of class. So if you want to kind of see how this all works, there's an example in the book, and you can look at that or browse it to see what you think. Basically, Lévi-Strauss believed that the savage mind has all the same structures as the civilized mind, that human characteristics are the same everywhere. So we've kind of ran into this earlier with Campbell, this sort of idea of syncretism. But he borrows a lot from structural linguistics, structural thinkers like Ferdinand Saussure, and applies it to language. So it becomes infinitely more sophisticated when you do that. I will link a YouTube video called The Theories of Myth, Crash Course in World Mythology, which kind of show you a lead up to Claude Lévi-Strauss so you can understand the theoretical growth in the discipline. Perhaps as a comment to this video, you might watch that and then comment on this video about which system you feel suits you the best. Which do you think is the best way to approach mythology from your standpoint? Is it the more simpler analysis, or does this sort of very sophisticated gridding of ideas actually yield, or you think yields scientific results? Myths and stories for Lévi-Strauss are an understanding of human nature. They have a functional message of idea and ideals that can't be completed in a single storytelling. So what Claude Lévi-Strauss would do is go out and collect as many different variants as he could over space and time, in a way a bit like the compilers of the folklore, the Grimms. He was interested in versions and variations of stories, and it's the aggregate rendering of the myth that was important, not a single telling. So his method was to create a grid of elements, and he would write an individual element on a card. So he created his own sort of strange pre-digital cataloging system for mythology. He would then arrange them by rows and columns, sort of like playing solitaire with cards, according to issues and topics. And if you read across the rows, it would be like the linear story. You'd get the linear story that you've read. What he liked to do is read down the columns, so that you understood stories by different groupings of ideas, and new meanings would come out. Sort of similar to music. Those of you who study music, you normally have a melody in the treble clef, or say a solo instrument would play it, like I play the cello, so it would have a melody. And then you would have a piano or an orchestral accompaniment, or maybe the left hand on the piano, that would provide the harmonic background to the music. While Lévi-Strauss believed that our way of understanding stories was based on the melody. We perceive of the melodic movement, the linear aspect of stories, rather than the harmonic underpinning of certain stories. So he's trying to get at a subconscious depth to these particular stories, but he did it scientifically. He didn't just state that there was one like Campbell, he actually came up with a system to pull it out, and it was these rows of cards that he would systematize. So our current analysis is a very basic and simple, non-nuanced understanding of a story, which he insisted actually was more chaotic than his more enlightened view of particular stories, which is why a lot of myths are weird and lacking logical continuity, but still similar across cultures. We've read a lot of strange stories this semester, but we've found analogs to those stories in other cultures. And Lévi-Strauss believed we were reading them wrongly. We need to understand not just the linear outlay of a particular story, but all of the in-depth underpinnings, the harmonic structure behind these stories. That's the best way I can perceive of it, is in a musical way. So myth itself is a kind of language made up of constituent units, what he called gross constituent units, which prevented a higher and a more complex order to things. And so he would render stories in the shortest possible sentences, lay them out with index cards by function, and then he'd build the vertical lines to read into the stories with more depth. That's the most simplistic way I can put it. Of course, it's a lot more nuanced than that. He's not looking for isolated relations between the elements of a story, but bundles of relations, pockets of ideas. These may be diachronic, converting more than one time period, or synchronic, going across linear time. So Lévi-Strauss plays with the whole idea that things happen in a linear sequence. He believes that there is a much more complex way in which time is rendered and experience is applied to time. Of course, this gets into physics, which some of you may be much more fluent with than I am. So he's looking for stories that become diachronic, covering more than one time period, covering more than one version of a story, covering more than one cultural rendering of a story, and sort of finding an aggregate meaning, if you like. Myths then become the duplication, triplication, quadruplication of sequences, repetitions, structures, contradictions, you name it. And his idea is that if you could grid these out and understand them, and you could see the relationships between these different things, you could definitely resolve how the mind works with binary structures. Everything then can be untethered from a very simplistic way of looking at things. By binary, I mean things like black, white, night, day. These oppositional states or dualisms that humans have been conditioned to perceive everything male, female. Everything is a series of opposites. Well, if you look at things in a different way, you can break that simplicity and come up with a much more meaningful and complex way of looking at these particular stories. So basically, that's as deep as I'm going to get into Lévi-Strauss, because I think it can be a black hole that we could drop into for a few weeks. You can see in reading through this chapter some visual examples of what I'm talking about. If you go to page 443, you'll see the columns and the numbering system that he has. If you look at page 444, you'll see the an example of the synchronic versus the diachronic, looking across the line or down the row, and also how he groups things into functions. And this is where the criticism comes in. Who gets to decide how you take a story in language and break it into building blocks and arrange? It takes a consciousness to do that. So the criticism of Lévi-Strauss is that he himself instead of looking at a myth in pure form, he is imposing his will and his personality on the myth, deciding how it breaks down, and that is not necessarily, according to some of his critics, that scientific. You can see on page 448 his breakdown of a Zuni myth. If you want to see how this works, or Ash Boy and Cinderella on page 450, and so on. There are a lot of different ways of looking at this. There's also a section on Oedipus as well, if you're familiar with that story. So, I just basically wanted to show you how in-depth mythological theory can get, how complex the idea of mythography can become by picking the most extreme example available to us in the textbook. I wish I had time to go through some of the other thinkers that we were going to look at, but we had to cut down the semester due to the changes imposed upon us. But if you're interested in your own time over the summer, you can follow up with James Fraser, an interesting Scottish anthropologist and folklorist who wrote The Golden Bough, or Robert Graves, who is a British poet and a historical novelist, rewrote the Greek myths in contemporary prose, came up with a book called The White Goddess, which talks about the European origins to myth, pre-Christian, very pagan ideas about where all our inspirations and beliefs come from as Europeans. Maybe you'll find that interesting as well. And then Eliade, which I was going to group with Mircea Eliade, which I was going to group with Campbell, because his ideas are from the same period, is also an interesting thinker and philosopher. His book Myth and Reality from 1975 is also stunningly interesting. He comes up with some similar ideas to Campbell, but from a slightly different perspective. So if you're interested in following that up in your own time, those of you who are into that sort of thing, there are some names of thinkers that we would have looked at had we had time in this particular class. Next week we'll get to Freud and Jung and their influence on mythology, which is just as stunningly fascinating, and that will be our last week of topic for this class, and we'll start talking about the final. All right, folks, have a great week. Stay safe.